Okay, we're going to be looking at one of the two main normative ethical theories today. We're going to be looking at consequentialism, and then the next lecture will be on its rival, non-consequentialism. There are other normative ethical theories, and we will touch on some of those other ethical theories throughout this course, but the two main ones that's still pretty dominant today, and especially dominant in a lot of the readings we'll be encountering this semester, they're generally going to fall into either the consequentialist or non-consequentialist camp. Okay, so consequentialism. Well, like I said, there's two types of normative theories. Consequentialism, which we're looking at today, and I'm being repetitive, holds that we ought to do whatever maximizes good consequences. That is to say, X is good. X could be some action or is right if and only if X maximizes good consequences. And its rival, non-consequentialism, would hold that some actions are right or wrong in themselves, that is, irrespective of the consequences. Or some actions are wrong, and not just because they have bad consequences, but for other reasons. Non-consequentialism, so the word non basically means every normative theory that's not consequentialist is a non-consequentialist normative theory. And there's a lot of them. Don't get the impression like there's just this one unified theory called non-consequentialism, but we'll explain more about that in the next lecture. So, pop quiz. You are a high-speed electric train conductor. You have just been notified that the brakes on your train have been disabled by a very evil man. Fortunately, your train will naturally slow down in time before it arrives at the train station, as the train system will cut power, slowing your train down. So everyone on the train, including yourself, will be fine. However, you just found out that at a place where the track splits and then later rejoins itself, there are hostages tied to the tracks. So if you go to the left of the split, you'll end up killing one hostage. And if you go to the right of the split, you'll end up killing 5 hostages. Now, you obviously can't slow down before running anyone over. And here's another thing. There's not enough time to free the hostages. You've maybe 30 seconds. Someone spotted them from a helicopter. There's no way to untie them and free them. It's an unfortunate situation. So, and again, you have no choice. You can either go left or right because it splits and then rejoins. So, what do? Pause, think about it. You're the conductor. You only have 2 choices. Are you going to go left or are you going to go right? My hunch is that you would go left and only run over 1 person and avoid running over the 5 persons were you to go right. But the question is why? Well, most people say that it's worse to kill 5 persons than it is to kill 1 person. Or to phrase it differently, it's better to kill 1 person than it is to kill 5 persons. That is, the consequences of going right would have been worse than the consequences of going left. So, this leads to the great debate of normative ethics. Do consequences alone determine right and wrong? Obviously, in the previous scenario, consequences were the decisive factor in the decision you would make. The question is, does that apply to all moral judgments we make? Well, there is a normative theory, obviously consequentialism. We're going to look at mostly utilitarianism, which is a type of consequentialism today, which does hold that, pretty much the consequences alone do determine morality, do determine what moral judgment we should make. And they have some interesting reasons for why they hold that, and some of them might be pretty persuasive. So, classical utilitarianism, which is what we're going to be looking at, is a normative theory, which is a type of consequentialism, and it holds that we ought to always do whatever maximizes the balance of pleasure over pain for everyone affected by our actions. So it's not just consequences alone, but it's certain types of consequences. Maximizing pleasurable consequences and then minimizing painful consequences. That's basically what it says what we ought to do for all our actions. So, it's this great utilitarian principle. Always maximize pleasure over pain. Now, that's just the sum of their theory. It's one principle. for any action you do the action that maximizes pleasure for all affected parties and minimizes pain for all affected parties. Pretty simple. It gets trickier when you ask, how do you apply this principle to your actions? So classical utilitarians offer two ways to apply this principle, directly and indirectly. Let's look at the direct way first. So to apply the great principle of utilitarianism directly for some action, you do three things. First, you figure out your options. So for example, suppose you have two options right now, A or B. A is you could eat a donut. B is you could punch your grandmother. Two, you would estimate the likely pleasure and pain consequences of each option on the affected parties. So you're thinking about it and say, okay, so both A and B would make you happy if you're a sick, twisted human being. But A, eating a donut, would make no one miserable. And B would make your grandmother miserable, unless she was a boxer, in which case you will be the one who's miserable. And then once you figure out the pleasure and pain consequences of the different actions, you decide on the action that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain. And then whatever the option is that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain would be your moral duty. So eating donut would maximize pleasure if the only two choices were A or B. Eating a donut would be your duty. Now, of course, morality, well, actually, our decisions we make are way more complicated than that. We have many more options throughout the day. And it's also hard to calculate all the consequences throughout time. This is obviously a very simplified model. So, like I said, these steps, I mean, in the case with the donut and punching grandma, it doesn't take that much time of thinking, but for most actions, there's a lot more involved. And it would take a lot of thinking and a lot of time. And we don't do that for every decision we make. It's just we wouldn't get anything done, for one thing. Further, steps 2 and 3 could be difficult. So take a look at step 2 again. Estimate the likely pleasure and pain consequences of each option on the affected parties. That would require trying to discover all of the future consequences of your actions. But that's not possible for you to calculate. I mean, like a dinosaur farted 65 million years ago, and that might have made a difference to the physical structure of sediments in North Dakota a million years later. Try to figure out all of the consequences of your actions. It's just, you're not a prophet, you do not have the gift of foresight, you are not a fortune teller, you are not divine. So that's just, it's a, impossible burden. And step 3, remember, which is decide which options, whatever option maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain would be your duty. Well, that would require like adding up the benefits and harms. But as of yet, it's not obvious what numerical values you could add to various harms and pleasures. So like donut gets +9, whereas getting pinched is like -1. Like what kind of scale would we use to weigh pleasures and pains? Obviously, I do know paramedics have a pain scale. They can, 10 is the most horrible pain, 1 is like a mild itch, 4 you're bleeding, like 8 you've gotten a broken limb. But I mean, what about emotional pains or psychological pains? And pleasures as well. Like, what numerical value would you get to compare the pleasure of like eating really delicious shrimp versus the pleasure of, skydiving? So, yeah, it's just, so steps 2 and 3 have some problems. Well, this isn't the end of classical utilitarianism. Remember, this is just one of 2 approaches. This is the direct approach. There's also this indirect approach. Maybe that's better. So, indirectly applying the great utilitarian principle to maximize the net balance of pleasure over pain works by applying a rule of thumb about what kinds of actions tend to have good or bad results. So, for example, don't steal would be a useful rule of, that says of thing. That's supposed to say rule of thumb. I apologize for the typo. Thing should mean thumb. So, for example, don't steal would be a useful rule of thumb, since stealing generally has bad results. So, instead, for every action, you don't have to calculate all the consequences. Instead, you could just think about some general rules of thumbs. So, generally, when you steal, the consequences are worse. The sum balance of consequences is bad as opposed to good. Generally, when you lie, it's bad as opposed to good. Generally, telling the truth is good instead of bad. Helping old ladies cross the street generally has better consequences. Calling your parents once a week at least when you're in college, let them know how you're doing, generally good. So just general rules of thumbs. You don't have to calculate for everything you do then. You just think about these rules of thumb and then use those as guides for the most part. That would be a huge time saver. So that's one thing that the indirect approach, that's one merit of the indirect approach. So the question is, when then should you apply the principle of utility directly though? So a rule of thumb doesn't mean you always do it, it just means that most of the time you do it. But what about occasions when you should just use the direct approach? Henry Gensler, the author of the chapter we read on this, has some, I think, some very good suggestions. One, when you're making big decisions, like where you should go to college or what your major should be, that's when you just do it directly. And we probably all do that. Two, when moral rules conflict. Okay, so I think Gensler's example in the book's pretty tame. I'm going to use a more extreme example, but it's actually happened in history. So it's a general rule of thumb to tell the truth, to be honest, and to not lie. We can all agree to that. We're better off if we just don't lie, for the most part. But suppose it's World War II, and you're in Poland, and you're one of the heroic persons in Poland that was willing to hide Jewish persons in your attic at the risk of you being set off to concentration camps in addition to the Jews in your attic. And an SS guard knocks at your door and just asks, "We're just doing a routine search of the we're just visiting the houses in the neighborhood. You're not hiding any Jewish persons in your attic, are you?" And here's the dilemma: you got a duty to tell the truth, a rule of thumb to be honest, but you probably also have a rule of thumb duty to protect your neighbors, to protect people from getting killed, basically. Probably also to preserve your own life, because you probably wouldn't live long too if you're shipped off to a concentration camp. So you've got a conflict then between two rules of thumb: tell the truth versus protect your neighbor, preserve your life, prevent persons from getting killed unjustly. What do? There's this conflict. Well, this is where you apply the direct approach. You calculate the consequences, and you would determine that the consequences of telling the truth would be worse than the consequences of lying to the SS guard. So you should lie to the SS guard. Simple as that. Another occasion to apply the principle of utility directly would be when trying just to determine moral rules to begin with. So, for example, lying generally has bad consequences. So via the principle of utility, you can arrive at the rule: do not lie. Alright, some things about classical utilitarians. One, they do believe in rules. They believe in moral rules. They just don't believe that there are exceptionless rules, with the exception, pun intended, of the principle of utility to always maximize pleasure over pain. That is the one rule that has no exceptions. Always maximize pleasure over pain. But the rest of the rules are not exceptionless. Sometimes you should lie. Sometimes, for example, so utilitarians then see this as a benefit of their theory. They have three problems with exceptionless rules. First problem with exceptionless rules: having more than one exceptionless rule can lead to contradictions, because it can prescribe conflicting actions. So if tell the truth was an exceptionless rule, and protect your neighbors from being killed unjustly is an exceptionless rule, when the SS guard is at your door and you've got Jewish persons hiding in your attic, you're going to have a conflict. If you don't believe in exceptionless rules, though, except for the principle of utility, you can avoid these conflicting, contradictory moral prescriptions. Second problem with exceptionless rules is that they can lead to inhumane results. So, for example, you've probably heard of the movie and the play and the book Les Miserables, where Jean Valjean is in prison for 19 years at the beginning for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving nephew. Okay, is it really wrong to steal a loaf of bread if the only other option is starvation? So that's one. So yeah, critics of exceptionless rules say that they can lead to these horrible, inhumane results. Duh, you should steal bread if it's the only other alternative is starvation. And then third is this kind of exaggerated example. One thing about normative theories is we want to look at all possible scenarios, including science fiction scenarios, because they say that, like, for example, the principle of utility is the only conceivable exceptionless moral norm. Well, then you want to think about how it would apply to all conceivable situations. And the following situation, while exaggerated and science fiction-ish and kind of comical, is conceivable. So we want to see how well this does in this hypothetical scenario. So this is called the Dr. Evil objection. Would you obey an exceptionless norm, like always tell the truth, even if doing so resulted in Dr. Evil torturing every living human being? So Dr. Evil says, if you break this one exceptionless rule, I will not torture every human being, but if you don't break this exceptionless norm, I will torture every human being. And the objection goes, duh, you should break the exceptionless rule. In which case, it's not exceptionless. Okay. So recall that classical utilitarianism is one type of consequentialism. There are other types of consequentialisms that we're going to briefly look at. The first type is called egoism. Egoism holds that you should only maximize good results for yourself, not for others. You don't have a duty to maximize good results for others. In fact, your only duty is for yourself. Hence ego, I-ism. Utilitarianism, which we've looked at, which says maximize good results for everyone affected by your action. We've been looking. Now, utilitarianism comes in two flavors: hedonism and pluralism. Hedonism holds that we should evaluate consequences solely in terms of pleasure and pain. Pluralism says that we should evaluate consequences in terms of a variety of goods. So let's look at hedonism first, because it's simpler, and it's been popular throughout history. So, but before we do that, egoism has some problems, which is why we're not going to really seriously consider it. So egoism holds that everyone ought to do what maximizes their own self-interest, regardless of how it affects others. However, to hold I consistently, we'd have to, number two, want other people to live that way toward us. But if X is harming us, maximize X self-interest, then we ought to hold that X ought to harm us. But that's absurd. So egoism, according to Gensler, leads to kind of internal contradictions. And were we teaching an ethics course, I would spend a lot more time talking about that. For the record, I will just say that I agree with Gensler, and I think a much stronger argument could be presented for that. Alright. So the next issue concerns how consequences should be valued then. Hedonists say that only pleasure is intrinsically good, and only pain is intrinsically bad. So if you're a hedonist, the only thing good in itself, not good for something else, but good in itself is pleasure, and the only thing bad in itself is pain. Other things that would be good, like exercise. A lot of people don't find exercise pleasurable. But health is why you exercise. So you don't exercise for itself, you exercise for health. And then presumably health is more pleasurable than not being healthy, which is more painful. So exercise is not good in itself, it's good for health. So if you keep asking is X good in itself or good because it's good for something else, eventually, according to the hedonist, you'll just get to pain and pleasure. Pain being the thing that's bad in itself, and pleasure being the thing that's good in itself. Okay. A different view is called the preference view, which holds that we should maximize the consequences people prefer for its own sake. And then the third view is the pluralist view, which holds that many things should be maximized, like knowledge and virtue and pleasure. Right off the bat, the preference view has problems. People can have bad desires, such as the desire for heroin, for example. So, preference view is probably not the best way to assess consequences. The hedonist view, as mentioned before, is the simplest, though, so we're going to examine that. Alright, but according to Gensler, and I agree, there's some bizarre implications of the hedonist view, which holds, again, good just is pleasure and bad just is pain. It's only good in itself is pleasure, and the only thing bad in itself is pain. Suppose you lived in a town where mobs enjoy public executions. You find out that they, in spite of your innocence, they want to publicly execute you. And in fact, executing you would maximize the overall pleasure, because you're just one person where there's perhaps 1,000 townsfolk who are all bloodthirsty. So the pleasure of 1,000 people presumably is greater than the pain of just you. So if you're a good hedonistic utilitarian, you're kind of obligated to let them hang you, even though you're innocent. Okay. Again, that's bizarre. Most people would say, if that's what hedonistic utilitarianism leads to, then I think I'm going to find a different moral theory. I think that's a false moral theory, because you should never kill an innocent person, no matter how many people get pleasure from it. All right. So there are three options, though. The hedonistic utilitarianism has three options for addressing this puzzle, this dilemma, this bizarre implication. One, they could, in spite of your protests, just bite the bullet, let the townsfolk hang you, and say, yep, that is an implication of our theory that the innocent person should be killed by the townsfolk, and that's all there is to it. Most people would reject utilitarianism for that very reason, but some utilitarianisms will just kind of man up and say, yep, that's a consequence of our theory. We're cool with that. Another tactic, though, which I think is a little bit more promising, is just deny that a situation like that could ever actually happen. And then the third is just, well, we'll see if we can modify utilitarianism so we don't have this bizarre implication. So you could, of course, as I mentioned, bite the bullet and agree that you should have the townsfolk execute you. But then, of course, there are moral theories that don't have this bizarre and painful result. I think most people, we should assess those moral theories first. You could argue that's not possible, that the long-range consequences of executing an innocent person, you, for the pleasures of a bloodthirsty crowd, would in fact be bad. So you just argue that, in fact, it would be bad overall, not good overall to do that. It would, in fact, create more pain overall. Here's the thing, though. This is a thought experiment, and we can always find a way to modify the thought experiment to avoid bad consequences. Third, we could just modify the theory to hold that maybe pleasures, except sadistic pleasures, are good, and sadistic pleasures are bad. And this is kind of like the approach that the rule utilitarian would take, so we'll stay tuned on that. But it's not quite the same approach, but it's kind of. I'm going to say right now, this is kind of ad hoc. Look that up. All right. There's other bizarre implications of classical hedonistic utilitarianism. So, for example, should you kill 100 innocent children if you found out that you could somehow relieve 1 billion human beings of an annoying itch or headache? Now, it seems like in a case like that, the pleasure of the billion would, in fact, outweigh the pain of the kids. But most people say you should never kill 100 innocent kids just to relieve people of an itch, no matter how many people get relieved of an annoying itch. So, given these bizarre implications, there's another theory called rule utilitarianism. It tries to avoid these bizarre consequences, and it does this by making two moves. One, instead of being a hedonistic utilitarianism, where it just says only pleasure is intrinsically good and only pain is intrinsically bad, it changes to pluralism, which says there's a plurality, I guess, of intrinsic goods. And then the other move is to move from what's called act utilitarianism, which is what we've been assuming all along, to what's going to be called rule utilitarianism. So let's look at 1 and 2 in turn. First, 1. The rule utilitarian will deny that pleasure is intrinsically good and pain intrinsically bad. For some, pleasures are in fact just bad, like taking heroin, or someone who just takes pleasure in torturing others. Yeah, so in fact, there are bad pleasures. And this is an obvious datum of human existence that the hedonistic utilitarianism has somehow missed, I guess. So they're going to hold instead that there are several things that are intrinsically good, like virtues, knowledge, pleasure. Yeah, some pleasures will make the list. Life, freedom. So then the pluralist, contra the hedonist, notes that there are many things that we desire for its own sake, as opposed to just pleasure alone. So recall, the hedonist would say that the only thing we really desire for its own sake would be pleasure, and the only thing we desire to avoid for its own sake is pain. Other things we desire, not for their own sake, but because they can bring us pleasure. This is what the hedonist says. The pluralist denies that. Here's why. This is called the experience machine thought experiment. So imagine that you're a soul in heaven awaiting a body, and an angel finally comes up to you. You've been in the waiting room for a long time and says, okay, we've got 2 different lives you can choose from. We'll just give you the details of each life, and then whatever you pick, it's yours. The first life, you can be a secret agent. You'll travel the world. You'll have cocktails with very important politicians. You'll possess many skills. You'll be fluent in many languages. You'll basically be James Bond. The other option has the same amount of pleasure as the first one. So the first option has a lot of pleasure, the James Bond option. The other option has an equal amount of pleasure. It's a tie. And also, the other option is going to have similar experiences. That is, the second option will also have secret agent-like experiences with all the bonuses. You will experience drinking cocktails with politicians. You'll experience getting in cool gunfights and traveling the world. There's just one catch. Even though the other option does have similar experiences and is also tied in pleasure, the other option doesn't actually have you being a real secret agent. Instead, when you get a body, you'll be in the Matrix, living as a human body battery for robots. The robots will be feeding secret agent-like experiences into your brain, and you'll get all the pleasures associated with that, but in reality, you'll be sitting in a bath of pink goo. So, question, which life would you choose? The real secret agent's life, or being a battery for robots, but having secret agent-like experiences? Most people prefer the first option. They get to be a real secret agent, not just a body in a bath of goo having secret agent-like experiences. Here's the question though, why do most people prefer the first option? Including Davis, I prefer the first option. Why? Well, the answer most people give is that it's better to have authentic experiences than merely simulated experiences, even if the simulated experiences are equal in pleasure to the authentic experiences. But if people prefer the authentic experiences over the simulated experiences, even though they tie in pleasure, then there's something to the real agent's life that you value for itself. The authenticity, I guess. But if you desire something other than mere pleasure for itself, you desire, for example, authenticity for itself, then hedonism is just false. Because hedonism says that the only thing we desire for itself is pleasure. But according to this experience machine thought experiment, we also desire authenticity for itself. So hedonism is false. Okay. The real utilitarianism acknowledges that. Yeah, hedonism is false. So instead we'll be pluralists. There's a plurality of things that we desire for themselves. There's a second component to this modified theory. And it's the rule component. Okay, so here's a distinction we'll draw. Act utilitarianism holds that we ought to always act with the best consequences. We ought to do the act with the best consequences. Rule utilitarianism says we ought to do what would be prescribed by the rules with the best consequences for people in society to try to follow. So instead of deciding each act based on the consequences, we formulate rules that have the best consequences, and then our duty is those rules. So that's the distinction. We've been assuming act utilitarianism all along. Rule utilitarianism is a different way of looking at it. So, rule utilitarianism takes a two-step approach to determining one's duty. First, you ask what rules would have the best consequences for people in society to follow. And then second, you apply those rules to your own actions. So the rule utilitarianism, they scorn the act utilitarian who thinks that he or she can accurately assess what maximizes good consequences for all their actions. They think oh yeah, we don't need the rules, we'll just think about the consequences of each action. But then here's the problem. You can talk yourself into doing all sorts of stupid things. And people, empirical evidence is that people do generally talk themselves into all sorts of foolish things all the time, as evidenced by these tattoos. So we're called in the mob that wants to execute you, even though you're innocent, and the unsettling utilitarian conclusion that you ought to let the mob execute you. Now remember, this was a problem for classical utilitarianism. The question is, can the rule utilitarian avoid this? And they'll say, yes, we can avoid that. That was really high-pitched. They'll say, yes, we can avoid that. The rule utilitarian responds to the problem by arguing that any rule that permitted the execution of innocent persons would have overall bad consequences. You wouldn't want to live in a society where innocents could be killed just to satisfy bloodlust, just because it was pleasurable to the many. Because you don't know if you'd be the innocent person. So, that's how rule utilitarianism overcomes that dilemma. This is the last slide, and I note that there are some serious problems with rule utilitarianism as well, though. And this would be a nice segue into the lecture on non-consequentialism. So first, applying the maximize good consequences test to rules. It's not obvious how that it's actually any easier than applying it to individual actions. How could you foresee all the consequences of a rule? It seems like it requires just as much like prophetic powers. Second, suppose that you're just a really bright person in a society of idiots. Well, why should you follow the rules when you can produce better results on occasion by not following the rules? So it seems like it's just not much motivation to be a rule utilitarian, especially if you're a smart person. And if you're, taking a class on moral philosophy, you probably are. Finally, rule utilitarianism, according to Gensler, gets the right results for the wrong reasons. So it just so happens, for example, that killing innocent persons overall has bad consequences. But is that the only reason it should be wrong to kill innocent persons? What if it just so happened that generally killing innocent people had good consequences? We'd still hold that it is wrong to kill innocent persons. So it's by luck, by happenstance, that rule utilitarianism would get the right results. But we want it to get the right results for the right reasons, I guess. Okay, so next lecture will be on non-consequentialism.